Today's reading is from the Gospel according to St. Luke. Now on one of those days, Jesus and his disciples got into a boat, and he said to them, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." So they launched out. But as they were sailing along, he fell asleep, and a fierce gale of wind descended on the lake, and they began to be swamped and to be in danger. They came to Jesus and woke him up, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And he got up and rebuked the wind and the surging waves, and they stopped, and it became calm. And he said to them, "Where is your faith?" They were fearful and amazed, saying to one another, "Who then is this, that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him?" Then they sailed to the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. And when he came out onto the land, he was met by a man from the city who was possessed with demons, and who had not put on any clothing for a long time, and was not living in a house, but in the tombs. Seeing Jesus, he cried out and fell before him, and said in a loud voice, "What business do we have with each other? Jesus, Son of the Most High God, I beg you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For it had seized him many times, and he was bound with chains and shackles and kept under guard. And yet he would break his bonds and be driven by the demon into the desert. And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. They were imploring him not to command them to go away into the abyss. Now there was a herd of many swine feeding there on the mountain, and the demons implored him to permit them to enter the swine. And he gave them permission. And the demons came out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. When the herdsmen saw what had happened, they ran away and reported it in the city and out in the country. The people went out to see what had happened, and they came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had gone out, sitting down at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they became frightened. Those who had seen it reported to them how the man who had been demon-possessed had been made well. And all the people of the country of the Gerasenes and the surrounding district asked him to leave them, for they were gripped with great fear. And he got into a boat and returned. But the man from whom the demons had gone out was begging him that he might accompany him. But he sent him away, saying, "Return to your house and describe what great things God has done for you." So he went away, proclaiming throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. We've been looking for some weeks now at the characters in the Gospels, and there are a lot of them. In fact, so many of them that we've been looking between Christmas and Easter at these characters now for the fourth year, and we'll end the series at Easter, but we'll still leave a lot of characters on the table who we won't even examine. There are that many different characters. Some of them are VIPs, and that are even known, not only were famous in their day, but were well known outside of biblical history, like Herod and Pilate. And then there are others who might be considered in the modern world nobodies. They're not named. They come on and off the stage very quickly, and then we never hear from them again. And they're not all human. You could say, what do you mean the characters aren't all human? Well, you may remember, I think it was last year, maybe the year before, we looked at an animal who was a significant character. That is the donkey Jesus rode into Jerusalem for his crucifixion. And that character was significant because it was an unbroken donkey, which if you sit on an unbroken donkey, you'll end up on your on the ground. And but Jesus sat on the donkey, unbroken as it was. It sort of joyously submitted to him because it somehow recognized him to be the Lord of creation. So he was a significant character. And then we looked at a spirit being, the tempter, who meets Jesus Christ in the wilderness after Jesus' baptism, and the tempter tries to derail the mission of the Messiah. Today, we're looking at two characters who could be categorized as forces or powers. And these are powers that have plagued the human race and have inspired great fear both in ancient people and in modern people. And you know, we're fascinated by what we're afraid of. And that's why these particular forces still generate a lot of movies. It's a lot of movies. It's almost like an obsession with us to make movies about the forces of nature and about supernatural forces. So we have movies about earthquakes and climate change and tsunamis and asteroids and sharks, icebergs, and I'm sure you can think of a whole lot of movies about natural disasters, the forces of nature, and supernatural things. People continuously make movies about vampires and zombies and ghosts and evil entities. And so today, because we're fascinated by what we fear, today we look at the storm and legion. Jesus Christ facing the forces of nature and of supernature. And these forces are used as characters. It's a literary device known as a foil. And that is a character who is introduced to be contrasted with the main character, or sometimes in opposition to the main character. And when the main character and the foil interacts, characteristics of the main character come to the surface. And so today, Jesus Christ and the powers. That's our topic. We'll look at it under two categories. Number one, how these episodes fit the flow of the story. And secondly, what these episodes reveal about the main character in the story. Again, how these episodes fit into the flow of the story. And secondly, what these episodes reveal about the main character in the story. If you're following through the book of Luke, you would have just read in the earlier part of chapter 8, Jesus Christ telling a very famous parable, sometimes called the parable of the sower. And that parable is to advance the idea that in Jesus Christ's kingdom, listening is of paramount importance. You must listen because he is the word from God. He is the seed come to bring life from heaven to earth. And he is seed sown, as the old writers used to say, promiscuously. He is scattered everywhere. He will address all different kinds of people as the word from God, but not everyone will receive the seed or will listen to the word in the same way. And so Jesus describes four particular responses. There is the hard soil, where the seed never penetrates, just sort of bounces off like a sidewalk. And then there is the seed full infested with weeds, where the seed lands into it, begins to grow, but the weeds, the worries of life, choke out the seed. Then he talks about shallow soil, where it's pools of water over rocks, and the seed springs up quickly, but it has no depth, no root, and it withers quickly. And then finally, there's those who simply receive the word with rejoicing, and they believe it, and they begin to bear fruit. And then immediately after telling that story, Luke tells us how that plays out in the ministry of Jesus. In other words, Luke will illustrate that particular story with the responses of different characters that we meet immediately after the story. People responding differently to who Jesus Christ is. Some do not believe, some believe for a moment and then they wither, and some really do believe and the seed takes root in them. And while we're watching these different characters respond in different ways, all the while, Jesus the teacher is preparing his students for a pop quiz. And that pop quiz is going to take place in the very next chapter, where Jesus Christ comes to them and asks them to answer the first test. Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And already you can see how these episodes are advancing that curriculum. They're bringing the disciples to answer that question. In fact, they're already asking the question themselves. When Jesus calms the sea, they say, who then is this, that even the sea and the wind obeys his voice? So again, these two miracles, this is the way they fit the flow of the story. Two miracle stories where Jesus Christ shows himself to be in authority over creation and in authority over the unseen world, each episode moving the 12 disciples a little closer to the place where they can answer that question and score highly on the quiz. The scene begins in Galilee, and that's where Jesus was from, and that's where most of the disciples were from. And in Galilee, the news is fully out that there's a miracle worker who spoke like no person ever spoke. And the crowds are coming from all over the place to get close to him. And it is so depleting on Jesus. He's surrounded by people like all the time. And they're pushing on him so that he has to continuously like back up, as it were, until he's finally at the seashore. Has to get into a boat and teach from the boat. And at this point, when Jesus and his disciples are so claustrophobic, so exhausted from ministering to the crowds, in order to simply just move, Jesus proposes that they get away from the crowds. And the teacher suggests a trip. A trip where, you ask? A trip to the other side. And really, that was a thing. That was bizarro world, the other side. The other side of the Sea of Galilee was where they lived, where the Gentiles lived. Sometimes that region was referred to as the Decapolis, 10 cities dominated by Gentiles, where if there were any Jews there at all, they were in a very small minority. Jewish people didn't go to the other side. And you see how this is an emphasis in the way Luke records it. You see it in the first verses of each of those two paragraphs. In verse 22, the other side. And in verse 25, the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. And it's like Luke is saying, and I don't just mean opposite geographically, like on the other side of the lake. I mean it is opposite in every conceivable way. Opposite spiritually and religiously, opposite culturally, opposite ethnically. It's the other side. Bizarro world. Like here, only the opposite. And maybe the disciples were thinking, if he wants to go there, to the other side, he must really, really want to get away from these crowds. Because you just don't go to the other side. But little do they know, it's really a field trip. It's going to be a learning experience for the 12 disciples. And then Jesus, obviously exhausted from serving and teaching the teeming masses of people, he gets on board this boat, which must have been a pretty big boat because there were at least 13 people on the boat, it appears. And that's when Jesus falls asleep. He's exhausted. He's depleted. He's given everything for the crowds. And when Jesus falls asleep, that's when the first of these two characters comes on the stage. A fierce gale of wind descended on the lake, and they began to be swamped and to be in danger. Now, think with me for a second about the passengers on that boat. Many of them were fishermen, and they could handle themselves on the Sea of Galilee, and they could handle themselves in a storm. Jesus, on the other hand, is not a fisherman. He's a landlubber. He's a construction worker. So it's a little odd that the seafarers, appeal to the landlubber, but they do, because this is not any storm. This is a killer storm. The wind and the water was surging. And Luke uses specific vocabulary, I think, that would have rung the bell of Jewish readers in that day. Anyone familiar with the book of Jonah, which had been translated by that time into the vernacular, the Greek language, anyone familiar with Jonah chapter 1 would have recognized the language, the vocabulary that Luke is using here. It's lifted right out of Jonah chapter 1. Luke is trying to show us a kind of connection. He's trying to say, that day on the Sea of Galilee, there was someone in our boat who was greater than Jonah. And so Jesus gets up and he rebukes the winds and the waves like he's speaking to a character. And if the disciples were afraid before the storm, when the water flattens out, and think about that, how that would work in a molecular physics kind of way, that the water goes flat. When that happens, they're really afraid. In fact, it says in verse 25, they were fearful and amazed. And they ask, who is this person who commands the uncontrollable forces of nature, the wind and the waves, and they obey him? And then they press on toward the opposite of Galilee, and they arrive on the other side in Bizarro World, and they find that Bizarro World was even weirder than it was rumored to be. And as soon as they land, they say, man, the rumors are true. This place is bizarre. It's like there's a billboard on the shore that says, now entering the unclean zone. And they get off the boat, and everywhere these Jewish men look, there are the loudest and clearest indicators. This place is unclean. On their side, in Galilee, everything was clean. People were always concerned with the law of Moses, and the clergyman, remember last week we saw the clergyman, we called him the monitor, Nicodemus. On their side, the clergymen were always walking around with their moral magnifying glass, and every time you did anything that was unclean, anything that broke the purity code of the Mosaic law, they were quick with their magnifying glasses to point it out. And you could count on it all the time. People were washing their hands. You could show up to a party, and if you went to grab some food, someone would say, did you wash your hands? And they'd point you to these huge quantities of waters that they had at all these festivities. Your clothing is wrong. It's not going to be clean. Doesn't fit the Mosaic code. I saw you on your way in today. You brushed up against a sick person. Did you realize you did that? No, I didn't realize it. Well, that makes you unclean. Can't come in today. Before you put that in your mouth, I think that might contain some shellfish. Unclean. But on this side of the lake, the other side of the lake, there are no monitors. And people are just being as unclean as they want to be. The Pharisees never come to the other side, because on the other side, everything is unclean. And that's when they meet a man who is not wearing the right clothes. In fact, he's not wearing any clothes at all. And it says he hadn't been wearing clothes for a long time. He's unclean in every way. He is possessed by an unclean spirit. To say he's not only unclean externally, but he is rotten to the core. He's not living in a house. Instead, he's living outside the city, away from people. And he has not had an occasional brush with death, because remember, to touch a dead thing rendered a person unclean. He hasn't had an occasional brush with death. Man, this guy dwells in the tombs. He emanates, he exudes uncleanness and chaos. The kind of person that if you saw him out in public, you'd put your hand over your children's eyes and say, honey, don't look over there. It's the image of God, but it is so defiled and ruined in every way that it's barely recognizable. And the shell of the man, and the word man is repeated 6 times to try to tell us, I know he looks like a zombie, but he's actually a man made in the image of God. The shell of the man is now only a shell. It's like a host for spiritual parasites. He's naked like a beast, and he has to be chained, but he's like a wild beast, and he escapes the chains like an animal. He's isolated. He's got no community. He has no contact, no conversation. He has no love. He's like the embodiment of the other side. The other side reduced to one person. And when you look at this guy, and would you even want to look at this guy? You just see a picture of uncleanness. And then a short conversation between the main character and the foil. The man correctly identifies the rabbi, Jesus, Son of the Most High God. In that sense, he's far ahead of the disciples, by the way. He uses the name of his opponent, Jesus, in order to try to get over on him, in order to try to dominate Jesus, the Son of God. But Jesus turns the tables. He asks for the name of the man. And the spirits in this unnamed man speak. They say, Legion. And that was a military term for a huge regiment of soldiers, up to 5,600. And I don't know that there were 5,600 spirits in the man, but in this shell of a man, a whole hive of spiritual beings are living in him. Or perhaps living is not the word. The right word would be using him. And the spirits try to negotiate with Jesus. And Jesus sort of plays along, and he allows them to go into a herd of swine. Mark's account, because this account is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Mark's account supplies us with the number. It says there were 2,000 pigs in the herd. It would have been what we would call an ecological disaster, that 2,000 pigs were found floating in the Sea of Galilee after this whole scene. And it's another exhibition that this is bizarro world. 2,000 of the uncleanest of the unclean animals. Pigs, 2,000 of them. No wonder the Pharisees and the clergymen always avoided the other side. And Jesus Christ sends these unclean spirits, these messengers of death and these defilers of God's image. He sends them into the herd. And the pigs immediately succumb to the death impulse, and they rush down the steep cliffs and they drown themselves in the lake. And the pig herders run off immediately to tell everyone in the city and in the country. And when the townsfolk arrive, they find this horror of a subhuman zombie man, now restored and rescued and human again, clothed and in his right mind. It's like a famous speech. Sometimes I think I call Missy and she says, TJ, how's your day going? And I want to say, well, at least I'm clothed and in my right mind. And I think Missy would respond, well, I'm sure you're clothed. As for the rest, I'm not really sure. So the townsfolk come and they find this hideous beast, now clothed and in his right mind. And he is sitting in the posture of a learner. He's sitting at the feet of Jesus where disciples sit. In other words, rationality is restored to his mind. Everything in bizarro world is unraveling and being made right. The demonic spirits are gone. The man has his will and his rationality restored to him. He's dressed and thinking and learning like a man, no longer like a beast. He'll be restored to his home. Jesus won't say when it's all over, okay, go back to the tombs. Instead, he'll say, go back home where the people are, where humanity dwells. I'm restoring you back to humanity, life among the living. And when the people see it, everyone rejoices, and they all lived happily ever after. Now, remember, there's more than one way to respond to the word that Jesus Christ is. And in this episode, we see some of those other faulty responses. The townies were freaked out by Bizarro Man, but they would rather have business as usual than to succumb to the power of this all-powerful liberator from evil. And they ask Jesus to leave, and he does. But before Jesus sails away, the new man who had been possessed by spirits, he asks for a seat in the boat. He asks to go along with Jesus, but Jesus ironically denies the request, and instead Jesus commissions the man. He makes the man into a preacher, and he sends him home. And he says, in one final flash of irony, go tell everyone what God has done for you. And Luke says, and so he went and told everyone what Jesus had done for him. Did the man think that Jesus was God? If he did, he was right. And once again, he was way ahead of the disciples. Well, now, with all the evidence that came in from this little field trip, this expedition to the other side, floating around in their heads, which would take a long time for the 12 to process all that they had seen and heard, but they start putting it together, and by the next chapter, they'll put it together enough to answer the pop quiz. Who do people say that I am? And Peter will answer, we say that you are the Christ, Son of the living God. That comes in chapter 9. They will now pass the test, the first block of curriculum that Jesus was teaching. They'll pass the first test, the pop quiz. They will know he is the Messiah. And the next test, the next unit, will be to explain what a Messiah is. Because they know he is the Messiah, but they don't know what a Messiah is. And Jesus is saying, I am the Messiah, and I've come to die for the sins of my people, because that's what a Messiah does. And that test will be even harder for them to pass. In fact, they will not be able to conceive of a Messiah who dies for his people. They could conceive of a Messiah who would drive out the horrible Romans from the land. But they could never think of a Messiah who would die for the sins of his people. Maybe they couldn't conceive of this because they didn't see themselves as needing that radical of a remedy. Now, people on the other side, they needed a radical remedy. They need maybe a Messiah who would even die for them. But we, good Jewish people, we don't live in bizarro world. We don't need a Messiah who would die for us, really, because we're not that bad. I mean, we're clean people. We wash our hands when we go to parties. We wear the right kind of clothes. We eat the right kind of foods. We wouldn't even have pigs on our side. We don't need a Messiah who would die for us. Bizarro people might. We just need a Messiah who could give us some how-to lessons. Help us with some life hacks so we could tweak our lives and live a higher quality of life. We need a prophet. We need a teacher. We don't need a sacrifice for our sins. Too bad they didn't see it. But they would. They weren't seeing yet that this little field trip was the whole mission of Jesus in one episode. They would after his death and resurrection, but for now they still don't see. They would see later that while they were in that sinking ship with Jesus, the better Jonah, when Jonah fell asleep in the book of Jonah, I don't know if you've read the book of Jonah recently, but it's kind of your homework for today. Go home and take a Bible and read the book of Jonah. It's four chapters. You can read it in probably 15 minutes long. It's fascinating. It's an unbelievable, amazing story. And in the book of Jonah, chapter 1, Jonah is running away from God. He books passage on a pagan ship, and God comes after Jonah. And God hails or sends a huge gale of wind down on Jonah and the boat, and the pagan sailors are going to die. And where do they find Jonah? Asleep, just like they find the better Jonah, Jesus Christ, asleep. And they wake Jonah up, and Jonah realizes, this isn't just any storm. This is God coming after me. This is God bringing wrath down on me. And the sailors say, well, how can we fix it? And Jonah says, it's not because of what you did, it's because of what I did. And the only way to fix it is for you to throw me overboard, to die in the raging, surging waters. And they did. And you see, later the disciples would look back on this event on the Sea of Galilee. And they would realize, we had one in our boat who was greater than Jonah, who, in order to save our sinking ship, in order to save planet Earth, the sinking ship that we are, he too had to be thrown into the raging sea of God's justice. The sea is such a potent symbol in all the Bible. Our Jonah, Jesus Christ, will have to face the penalty of our sin, and he will have to face the sea of justice for us on the cross. And that's exactly what he did. That's why in the book of Revelation, where the sea as a symbol shows up one last time, the sea is as calm as glass. Why? Because the greater Jonah has been thrown into it to satisfy the justice of God. And I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire. Justice has been satisfied by the end of the Bible, and the debt of everyone who believes is paid in full. Why? Because the sea of wrath is calm, because the greater Jonah, Jesus Christ, was thrown into it. And the second scene too, it's a microcosm demonstrating the whole story of Jesus Christ in its identity and purpose. Think about it. Why would Jesus Christ leave clean land, Galilee, and go to Bizarro land, the other side, just to get one lost sheep who's no longer even really human? He's just a shell. He's just a host for parasites. Why would Jesus go all the way into Bizarro world for one lost sheep? Why would he go to the other side just for one person? Well, don't you see? That's the very nature of Jesus Christ's whole mission. Don't you see that we live in Bizarro world? Boys and girls, it's getting weird out there. Have you noticed? Don't you get that we live in Bizarro world? And don't you see that you are the lost sheep? And the new Adam, the Lord of the new creation, has crossed the great divide and has come to claim you, to clothe you in the beauty of his record and righteousness, to make you right, clothed, and in your right mind? Don't you see that he finds us all in Bizarro world, guilty and dead, dwelling in the tombs, residing among the dead, waiting our turn to die? You know, I can't tell you the sequence, but there is a sequence. And 100 years from now, they'll be able to point out what was the sequence. We're all waiting in line to die. And one person will go first, and one person will go last, and we will all be in a line. I just thought I'd share that to cheer you up today. But the point is, we are all awaiting death, living, as it were, among the tombs. And what Jesus Christ did among the tombs is what he'll do on the grand scale. That's why it says in Hebrews chapter 2, therefore, since the children, that is us, share in flesh and blood, that is, we're physical, he himself, God himself, likewise also partook of the same. God had to become flesh and blood in order that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. See, Jesus Christ has gone to the other side. He's crossed the great divorce, the yawning gap between heaven and earth, much further than just to go from Galilee to the Decapolis. He went from the clean land of heaven to bizarro world, where we live among the unclean. It's a microcosm. God had to enter our situation, had to go to the other side, had to come into the fallen world where his own image is so marred and where there is death. God in Jesus Christ came into this world with devils filled that threatens to undo us. But he came for us. He crossed the raging sea. He came for you. Oh, how he loves us. Ain't no mountain high enough. Ain't no valley low enough. Ain't no river wide enough to keep him from getting to you, babe. Hello from the other side. That's what Adele sings. And that's what Jesus said. Hello from the other side. I am the ultimate Adam. I am the ideal man, the Lord of the new creation. And I'm giving you a picture, showing you what it will look like when I have reclaimed the garden that the first Adam surrendered to the devil. Only listen to the word that I am, the final word, the Savior of all who believe. Only believe. Now you may think, TJ, I'd like to believe, but this was clearly a picture of insanity, and they didn't know how to describe it in the ancient world, so they called it demons. Come on, really. We're scientific people. How can I possibly believe in demonic possession? I mean, it's fine to make movies about it, but you don't really believe it could actually happen, do you? And a man who could calm the waters just with a word, you really expect me to believe that? Well, let me quote to you, Westerners, enlightened Westerners that you are. Let me quote to you from the Bard. Here's what Shakespeare said in Hamlet. Remember, Hamlet to Horatio. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And we may think we have it all together. We have the unseen world figured out. But our brothers and sisters in the developing countries who have seen many more evidences of the supernatural world than we have would be quick to say, you people are arrogant and stupid if you don't believe in an unseen world. Maybe there are just more things than you dreamed of. Maybe this fixation that we have with disaster movies and with supernatural movies, maybe there's something hardwired into our soul, this cosmic battle between good and evil. And maybe there is a grand narrative. And maybe it really does all end with everyone who believes, clothed and in our right minds, sitting at the feet of Jesus, receiving from him in a restored world where everything is as God intends it to be. Look, I don't know everyone here, but I just want to appeal to you on the way out. Don't miss this grand narrative. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Don't run back to business as usual because you think this might disrupt your life. Let it disrupt your life. You'll be better off for it. Join us, the ransomed sinner train that we are. Come talk to me after the service. I'll give you some books to read, maybe set up a time to talk with you, help you work through and navigate these waters, no pun intended, and come to him who has power over creation and the unseen world. Let's pray together.